Who cares about Bonk's adventure when you have Screonk's adventure? It's Godzilla, Monster of Monsters on NES Works. Publisher Toho makes their NES debut in America, and they picked a big un to start with. Donkey Kong may have been gaming's 800-pound gorilla, but Godzilla makes him look like a measly little flea. I mean, in the movie, Kong's inspiration, King Kong, seemingly cleaned Godzilla's clock. But here, these guys are best of pals. Godzilla on NES. What kid wouldn't want that? Given the sheer prevalence of creepypasta memes about this game, I would estimate that every child who was age 6 in the year 1989 and eventually made their way onto the early millennial blogosphere played this game and found themselves traumatized by it. Though honestly, I can't account for what makes this game the target of so many homebrew horrors. Maybe it's the fact that kids wanted to just beat the crap out of kaiju, but instead found themselves locked into a hex-based strategy game. Now there's a jump scare. I wanted Rampage, but I got Avalon Hill. But that can't be it. Godzilla, Monster of Monsters is only barely a strategy game. This is not Desert Commander or Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Heck, it's not even Defender of the Crown. This is the Mad Minute Compile, being handed the Godzilla license and creating another hybrid adventure like they did with Golvelius. Only this time it's not a combination shooter RPG, it's a combination shooter, brawler, and war game. In a lot of ways, it's exactly the sort of experience that games like Golgo 13, Jaws, and Friday the 13th attempted to present to players. Although I'd have to say that this one, despite its shortcomings, does a much better job of it. The premise is thus. The fascistic space criminals of Planet X have threatened to invade the Earth with spaceships and an array of Godzilla's greatest kaiju foes. And it's up to you to make your way across the solar system, beginning on the moon, to put a stop to the invasion by moving across their occupied territory one hex at a time, and taking control of their planetary bases. Frankly, I can't think of a cooler way to introduce kids to the concept of classic PC-style wargaming. Who wants to play as Rommel's Nazis, or summon Robin Hood to help conquer a nation that hasn't even discovered indoor plumbing, when you could be Godzilla himself, or Mothra? Yes, in classic Showa-era style, this is the Godzilla who had softened on his seeking vengeance against humanity's nuclear crimes for Mother Nature's sake stance to become more of a catch-all protector of the planet, including, somewhat begrudgingly, the humans who live there. And he was willing to team up with other giant monsters who had once opposed him. In this case, that's humanity's actual protector, Mothra, who makes her way across the hex grids in alternating turns with the big guy. It's Destroy All Monsters, the video game. The battle to put an end to Planet X's predation takes place on a succession of worlds as our heroes work their way across the surface of each one in the fashion of a board game. Ultimately, your goal on each world is to occupy the base at the far end of the battlefield and use its teleporter to beam along to the next planet. Only by reaching Planet X and destroying the enemy's command battleship can you be assured of the Earth's continued safety. It's a weirdly long process, made even more demanding by the need for both of your monsters to reach the end of each battlefield in order to advance, and by the fact that the gameplay is a bit slow and repetitive. On the other hand, damn, this is cool. A game based on Godzilla could have just been a Rampage ripoff where monsters mindlessly tear down cities or something. Instead, Compile went and compiled it by going above and beyond the call of reason or obligation. There are certainly compromises to be found here, but for sheer refusal to accept the lowest common denominator of play, Godzilla, Monster of Monsters deserves points. For starters, no, you can't team up with another player to control both Godzilla and Mothra at the same time. That would have been a great feature, but it also would have been impossible for this specific game design to have pulled it off on the NES hardware. I mean, look at the graphics here. Godzilla and Mothra are massive player characters. Maybe the largest we've seen on NES outside of Predator's terrible Big Mode. And there's a hell of a lot more happening here than in that disgrace. For starters, Godzilla and Mothra battle through actual backgrounds, with destructible scenery and tons of enemies and projectiles accosting them at all times. Yes, there's lots of flicker and some slowdown, but honestly this is Compile doing their Compile thing, just like they did with Gulkov on SG-1000 and Power Strike on Master System, pushing hardware beyond the bounds of reason and looking damn good in the process. So you have to guide both monsters separately across the worlds and make sure they both reach the teleporter base safely. Each monster can move a certain distance for each turn. Godzilla can advance 2 hexes, while Mothra can move 4. And they have to slug their way through whichever hex they land on, a process whose outcome is affected by the nature of that hex. Each of the 8 planetary boards contains a variety of different environments in their hexes, which you can predict based on the icon within each hex. There's rocky wasteland, blazing volcanoes, jungles full of creepy living tendrils, futuristic moon domes, and, worst of all, enemy cities dense with defenders and stationary defenses. On the other hand, sometimes you'll land in subspace, a sort of breezy free-for-all zone where you can recover missing health points, and these relatively carefree spaces are offset by the hexes that contain monster icons. 8 different kaiju appear in the game on top of the Zako scrub enemies you plow through. Standard encounters on normal hexes really just amount to your hero monsters powering through an ocean of pissant nobodies, soaking up chip damage, and scorching, crushing, or disintegrating them with your overwhelming kaiju power. Enemy kaiju, on the other hand, pose a more significant threat, and you only have a limited time in which to defeat them. And you do need to defeat them. It's impossible for Godzilla and Mothra to advance past a hex occupied by an enemy monster until that kaiju has been put on ice. The big bads range from fairly easy opponents like Gezora and Mogera to hellish challenges like Gigan and Ghidra. Yes, the evil 3-headed king of kaiju himself is here, meaning that technically this episode is about the romance of the 3 kingdoms. Well, kingdoms, close enough. The rival kaiju appear on all worlds, growing more powerful with each rematch, but never really learning any new abilities. Then again, what abilities would you really expect? Godzilla Monster of Monsters is faithful to the kaiju concept, which means that your giant characters and their rivals move as sluggishly and clumsily as you'd predict. In any other game, that would make for a pretty miserable design choice, but here it seems necessary. If Godzilla were flipping around like Ryu Hayabusa, it would mean that Compile had completely failed to understand their assignment. And the 2 playable characters do play completely differently. Godzilla is exactly what you'd expect: enormous, slow, a giant bullet sponge target, shockingly powerful. Get it? Shockingly? In addition to his melee moves, a punch, a kick, and a tail swing, Godzilla also has the ability to fry enemies into submission with his atomic breath. You can't spam his breath attack though. That ability is regulated by the power meter, and blasting his death breath depletes a massive percentage of the meter. Thankfully, it recharges pretty quickly, especially as you build up your experience levels, but nevertheless the cooldown period on this powerful ability prevents you from just steamrolling the entire game. The same largely holds true for Mothra, even though she plays very differently. Mothra flies freely through the air, and she's great at evading enemy attacks. Only her body registers damage, not her wings, so she can slip right through raking fire and dodge incoming missiles with relative ease. As a trade-off though, her laser attacks are relatively weak compared to Godzilla's melee strikes, and her special power, dusting enemies beneath her with her poisonous powder, is much less effective than Godzilla's nuclear halitosis. Both characters need to reach the teleporter hex on that world in order to advance, which is more easily said than done. The enemy city-fortress spaces and the kaiju battles can really knock you for a loop. This is a surprisingly lengthy game considering its flimsy premise of monsters battle across the solar system, and thankfully it does include a password system. That's just as well, because playing through the entire game in a single sitting would be almost as repetitive and boring as completing Rampage in a single playthrough. I mean, this is a much better game than Rampage, no question, but there's only so much stomping through the same scenery you can do in a single sitting, nuclear breath or not. Still, you can appreciate how Compile made an earnest effort to provide real variety here. Each of the worlds you have to conquer has a distinct layout, and every world favors a specific sort of terrain. So there's some distinction between planets, and you have to give each battlefield some actual strategic consideration in how you approach it. For example, Neptune is massive and difficult, while Planet X is a linear gauntlet that reminds me in a funny way of World 8 of Super Mario Bros. 3, a game that, of course, had not shipped yet in the US, and in Japan had only predated the release of Godzilla there by a couple of months. Speaking of similarities, Monster of Monsters seems to have been heavily influenced by a PC strategy game by System Soft called Master of Monsters. And it's not just Godzilla's subtitle that echoes System Soft's creation. Master of Monsters also involved kaiju duking it out on a hex-style grid. You'd move around the battlefield, face off against a rival monster, and fight to see who died first. I'd almost call Compile's Godzilla a ripoff, except that Master of Monsters only preceded it by a couple of months. Compile kicked ass back in the day, but even they couldn't code and manufacture and distribute a game like this in 8 weeks. So it's just one of those weird coincidences, I guess. Speaking of coincidences, Monster of Monsters belongs to a surprisingly large roster of NES games based on boomer properties. We've already looked at a bunch of these, from Fester's Quest to Hollywood Squares, but of all of them, Godzilla is the one that really felt like it made the most sense at the time. For starters, Godzilla was every bit as much a Saturday afternoon UHF station staple as the Three Stooges or the Addams Family, but Godzilla feels more like the kind of thing that NES-aged kids were actually into. Sure, Godzilla movies feature a lot of talking by boring humans doing boring things between the rubber suit monster slugfests, but those slugfests were the kind of things that kids would sit through the Raymond Burr inserts to see. Godzilla is a combination of dragon and dinosaur who breathes nuclear fire and dismantles entire cities, which is pretty much freebase cocaine for kids who haven't quite developed the processing skills to distinguish a dude in a rubber suit from a real monster. And more importantly, Godzilla was relevant. In addition to all of those old movies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that showed up regularly on off-peak broadcast hours, Godzilla was in the midst of a major comeback in 1988. After petering out in the mid-70s, the Godzilla franchise took a break for about a decade before making a return in a sort of reboot of the series that hit Japan in 1984. In the US, that movie arrived a year later and was treated less as a reboot and more as a direct sequel, with Raymond Burr reprising his role as reporter Steve Martin from the localization inserts that Trans-World Films had shoved into the original 1954 movie in an attempt to make a Japanese film palatable to Americans at the time. The reboot was a modest hit on both sides of the ocean and relaunched Godzilla for the Heisei era. In fact, its first sequel, Godzilla vs. Biollante, arrived mere weeks after the NES game shipped. Although Monster of Monsters has nothing whatsoever to do with that reboot, it was enough to simply have a fresh Godzilla game on shelves at the same time as the new film. And this surely wasn't a coincidence. The NES game's publisher, Toho, is the same company that owns the entire Godzilla property. This seems like a strategically timed release. And in a way, Monster of Monsters showing up on NES feels like things coming full circle. When it first reached America in 1956, the original Godzilla King of the Monsters stood out for being the first international pop culture hit to emerge from post-war Japan. Japan had stretched itself desperately thin in World War II, and the casualties that resulted from the war literally decimated the country's male population in the dictionary sense of the word. But on top of the war shaking out to be a hopeless cause, the country's losses were amplified when the US dropped not one but two nuclear weapons on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the only use of atomic weapons as tools of war in human history. It took decades for Japan to recover from that devastation, and Godzilla was a crucial part of the healing process. The movie simultaneously came off as a meditation on the grief of nuclear annihilation and a demonstration of the resurgent Japanese film industry's technical and creative innovation. The 1984 film reframed the story of the original movie in the context of the Cold War, with Tokyo under threat not only by Godzilla, but also by the trigger-happy nuclear superpowers, the US and the USSR. And mere weeks after that film made its way to American theaters with its newly inserted Raymond Burr sequences, Nintendo launched the NES in New York City. I'll spare you the obvious tasteless attempts to draw a parallel between Godzilla stomping on Tokyo and Nintendo conquering NYC, and simply say that the NES neatly demonstrated just how profoundly Japan's technical and creative innovations spoke to a global audience. By autumn 1989, the NES had become the best-selling games console to that point in America, the country that had invented video games in the first place. The NES continued a lineage of incredibly cool Japanese exports that began, effectively, with Godzilla. So the arrival of Godzilla on NES feels almost like a passing of the torch. And it's a pretty noteworthy game on its own. A bit repetitive, sure, but built on an interesting premise, and bursting with genuine love for and fidelity to the source material. With its massive character sprites, excellent graphics, and single-direction facing gameplay, Godzilla makes for surprisingly strong counter-programming to splashy 16-bit brawlers like Altered Beast and China Warrior. No, it doesn't look as impressive as either of those games, but it offers far greater variety and substance to its action. That new wave of consoles may have had the dazzling graphics, but for the moment it was clear that the familiar ground of the original NES hardware still had the upper hand when it came to depth, even in a dumb game about rubber monsters fighting through space. And the familiar license certainly didn't hurt, especially when the developer did such a great job of representing the source material on screen. Everything from Godzilla's stomps as he enters a new stage, to the way Mothra is susceptible to being pinned, crying out in alarm, but merely immobilized rather than hurt. Feels like a love letter to the Showa-era of films. Honestly, revisiting this game after 35 years has come as a pleasant surprise. It's actually a lot better in hindsight than I appreciated at the time. This may be another NES game about boomer media, but damn it, this is how you do it right. Next time on NES Works, sadly, not all NES film adaptations are created equal.